Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for our AP review on civil rights. And again, I'd like to dedicate this one to some of my former AP Government Hall of Famers. I miss you guys and hope you're doing well. So last time we talked about civil liberties, which are constitutional protections for individuals from the government and the Supreme Court cases associated with those rights. Well, today we are looking at constitutional, legislative, and Supreme Court rulings that have protected or at least attempted to provide some semblance of equality or civil rights for groups of citizens in America. So we'll start by looking at what are sometimes referred to as the Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments, numbers 13, 14, and 15, intended to pass the freed slaves after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, putting an end to this horrible stain in our nation's history, and the 15th Amendment was passed to give African American men the right to vote in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War. However, probably the greatest outlet for equality and civil rights is the 14th Amendment, one that we have talked about in several lessons, but today we will focus on what's called the Equal Protection Clause. And those words, that no state shall deny to its citizens equal protection under the law, have continually been the basis for Supreme Court cases and challenges to unjust treatment or unjust governmental policies. Now, although the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, it was largely ineffective in stopping the rise of legal discriminatory laws, especially after the case you're probably familiar with, Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s, and its quote-unquote separate but equal precedent, which basically legalized segregation. And these discriminatory policies would last a long time, and some would argue are still in place today. And this brings us to our final must-know foundational document, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, that begs the question, if the 14th Amendment provided equal protection under the law, how were states and private businesses all the way up to the 1950s passing laws and policies that discriminated based on race? Unlike the rest of the foundational documents written in the 1700s, I like to think of MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail as a reminder that the Founding Fathers and our Constitution left some issues unresolved. America is still to this day a work in progress that continually struggles to advance equality for all of its citizens. A major breakthrough Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in 1954, utilizing the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, declared segregated schools unconstitutional, creating a legal precedent to challenge all racially segregationist laws. But the fight for racial equality was far from over. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed abolishing poll taxes to vote, a long-held practice to attempt to deprive blacks and the poor from participating in elections. That same year, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex, including public accommodations such as hotels and restaurants. And if you're writing an FRQ on Congressional use of the Commerce Clause, this is an example you could use. The next year, the Voting Rights Act of 1964 outlawed literacy tests, one of the last holdouts to deny the right to vote to minorities, and gave the federal government jurisdiction to oversee elections in states with a history of voter discrimination. An example you might use in a federalism FRQ of the increasing power of what are traditionally reserved powers. Of course, we know those monumental laws did not end discrimination or segregation in our country. One attempt to integrate schools was the practice of busing students of different races into different neighborhood schools. While the Supreme Court upheld this practice at first, they started to rule against it eventually. So let's talk about women's rights. Normally I cover the 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the right to vote in 1920 during my political participation lecture. And hopefully you learned about the women's rights movement last year in APUSH, but there's a few policies we need to cover in civil rights for APGov. For women's rights, we talked about in politics the influential interest group NOW, or a national organization for women, who attempted to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, ending gender discrimination. And this amendment has gained some increased attention recently, as it's only 2 states short of the 3/4 required to ratify it, despite the fact that the expiration date of the amendment has passed. Another policy passed by Congress is a bill called Title IX to provide equal incentives for educational opportunities for women. Often discussion of Title IX revolves around providing equal scholarship opportunities for both genders, including athletes. Another policy you need to know is what is referred to as affirmative action, most usually associated with colleges and universities trying to create more diverse student bodies. Some universities implemented quotas to save a certain number of acceptances for minorities, a practice that was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1978. However, in a 2003 ruling, the court said that colleges and universities could use race as a determining factor when considering admission to their schools. Finally, for LGBTQ rights, you should know about the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, passed in 1996, which defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Something we talked about in federalism, as marriage regulations are usually a reserved state power. However, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage is legally protected under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, which is no longer a required must-know case for AP, but one that is good to know as it demonstrates the continuing role the court plays in interpreting civil rights constitutional protections and creating a more fair and just America. Something to think about and a good place to end our review. Until next time, stay safe, my people, and be sure to subscribe for more lessons coming soon.